Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Industry Standards Compliance Using MBSE. My name is Donna Long, and I will be your host during today's webinar, presented by Ron Kratzky. We're excited to talk to you about using MBSE to show standards compliance. Our lead presenter today is Ron Kratzky, Principal Systems Engineer at Vitec. He is a retired United States Navy officer with over 20 years of engineering experience, managing nuclear engineering and combat systems on surface ships. Ron was introduced to the systems engineering practice near the end of his naval career while conducting mission and capability analysis for the Navy staff. For the last 15 years, he has worked as a systems engineer, supporting advanced systems development for a number of federal government agencies. He was introduced to CORE in 2007 and utilized CORE to manage system development tasks on 3 different projects in the 5 years before he joined Vitec. He is now a provider of professional services in Genesis and CORE, as well as a central part of the Vitec training team. Before Ron gets started, I have just a few housekeeping items. We will be answering questions at the end of the webinar. Please send your questions in as soon as you think of them through the Questions tab on the webinar control panel. Ron will answer as many questions as he can today, but if you do not get to your questions, we will reach out to you after the webinar. The webinar is being recorded today. If you experience connection problems during the live presentation, a recording will be available within 1 business day. The recording will be published to Vitec's webinar archive located on our website. At the conclusion of this webinar, a survey will open on your screen. Please take a moment to give us feedback on today's presentation or on what topics you'd like to see covered in future webinars. Now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Ron. Welcome, Ron.
Thank you, Donna. Good morning. I'm excited to present this information today. I have done some work in this, and we did some work late last year to figure out how to do industry standards and how to incorporate those into the model. So without further ado, let's jump into this. I found over the last working in industry over the last couple of years that one of the major things that we're trying to cope with is how we design systems so we can meet multiple different standard regimes. An example might be I'm trying to develop a product here in the US, but I also need to make it so that that product is compatible with a European design standard or a standard overseas someplace. Another typical situation we have is I have to design a product, but I've got to design it to maybe an IEC code as well as an ISO code or a Underwriter Laboratories code, or I may be using one series of standards, maybe a bunch of US standards, but when I look at the standards, I may have a standard that says do X and another standard that says do Y, and those standards aren't necessarily conflicting, but I really want to make one system requirement that will meet both of those standards. One might be no more than 10 pounds or whatever. Another one might not exceed 10 pounds in different standards, and I want to be able to meet both of those standards or show traceability to both of those standards. Additionally, many times when I'm creating a product, at the end or at some time in there, I have to get a government body or a regulatory body to look at my product and say that they certify my product or give my product a stamp of approval. So I want to be able to meet all those standards and be able to show to some auditing agency how my system has been designed to meet their particular standards. So when we look at the basic generic, what do we want to do in MBSE? We always talk about requirements and functions and components, but really when I talk about requirements, I'm looking at the system design, the requirements that I'm designing the system to. I really want to be able to trace the system requirements back to these standards. Well, many times in our design, we talk about having an originating need statement or something like that from a customer. But when I start doing the design, I have to pull in all these other standards. So I want to extend my my approach for model-based system engineering or extend my schema to be able to handle those instances. So I've got to develop a way in my model-based system engineering model to capture those standards and pull in the documentation and the design standard statements. And when I do it, I want to do it in such a way that I can provide traceability back to the standard so that I can trace from the system requirements to the standard so that I can look at the standard and show what systems requirements are used to meet the standard. And I also want to be able to do it so that I can in verification of the system, I can trace back to demonstrate that I've met the standard, if you want to call it in general terms, performance, the performance that's required by the standard. And that allows a regulatory agency to certify my system. So a quick review here, right? We have an MBSE model, and from that model we look at different views. But this is not so much a graphical set of views that we're doing here. It's really more of a textual thing. So we've got to be able to pull out textually some sort of graphs or or check sheets or tables to be able to walk through this traceability. We can do it graphically also through the hierarchy diagrams, but I'm going to focus on how to do it, bringing out a table so that an inspector can walk through a table and understand how my system design meets his standards. So first, let's talk about how would I extend the model. So I want to include standard requirements in my MBSE model. I want to be able to relate from this standard, if you will, to the system requirement. And I want to do that in such a way that I can capture multiple standards. And I can also capture it so that a requirement can be traced to more than one standard requirement statement. And again, I want to support this concept of being auditable and traceable, no matter which way I work on the system, or which way I want to look at things. So what I'm going to do here is, what I want to do here is to, hang on a second. Again, we recognize this sort of schema model. We have this in our schema right now in Vitek. We have a document, and a document documents requirements, and requirements are refined by one another, and I can show that from that particular originating document back to that requirement. However, when I have a standard, we may have system requirements which are related to more than one standard. So I have to capture this somehow. So in essence, I need to extend the schema. So what I'm going to do here, what we've set up in a schema extension, is we've set up this ability through this schema extension to add this standard class, and the standard class is going to have this documented by relationship to a document, and then the standard entities will either be satisfied by a requirement, or a requirement in my system design will show compliance with a particular standard statement. Now, I'm going to demonstrate how to do this in Genesis. So the next thing I want to do is, well, if I have this standard and I have this schema extension, where is it? So we've provided a schema extension, and if you navigate in your Genesis installation to the standard compliance extension in this file folder here of extensions, you'll have a security classification and a standard compliance schema extension. So I'm going to look at this standard compliance schema extension, and I'm actually going to, in a moment, I'll import this Genesis file and show you how it extends the schema. So if you look at the PDF users guide here, there's a guide here. This guide has 3 sections in it. The first is a purpose, gives you a general understanding of what the extension does. There's a good explanation of each individual thing that's used in the schema extension. that I just showed you that graphically, and how to use this schema extension. So to use the schema extension, you would go to import this. You'll import it into your project. This is the way it comes up. You'll navigate to it. You want to import it into, and I have a blank project here, but this would actually be whatever project you're importing this schema extension into, and you'd walk through the schema extension. So what I'm going to do now is I'll walk through exactly how to do that in Genesis, and then we'll look at the schema has been extended. So I'm going to switch now to this blank project, okay? And when I'm in Genesis on this blank project here, I will just go through the import, and I'm going to import. I've already navigated to this file folder location, and I'm going to bring in this standard compliance schema, and walking through what I just did on the slides here. I'll walk through, and I'm going to import this into my blank project here. It's telling me I've gotten some incremental data. It'll go through and do the checks on the import to make sure that I don't have any conflicts. I haven't extended something in conflict of the schema here, and this just takes a minute for us to walk through the checks. So it finished that the extension, and if you look here, nothing really has changed. What I need to do now is I'll go back, and you'll see a change, and you'll have this new standard class added to the schema. So let me go back to my blank project here, and if I switch out of Essentials, you're not going to see this in Essentials or Systems Engineering. I need to go to All Classes, and then you'll see this new class here called Standard, and it's in the model. Okay. So once I have this extension in there, the next thing I want to do is look at the standard class properties. So I have a quick little property page here, but this is the property page for a standard element. So first thing you'll note is I have the description, and the description is meant to capture the text taken directly from that standard. Much like we do originating requirements, when we capture those in requirements, we're going to keep that original text here. So whatever the text is that's in the standard document, we're going to put that text in here for each section. And then I have a traceability to the section number. Now that's going to become important because I want to show not only that I have this standard, but that standard traces to a particular standard in a particular section or paragraph number of that standard. The next thing that we have here is this attribute called standard applicability. Now this standard applicability is a drop-down list, and I have in here mandatory, recommended, and not required. Many times you have a standard and the standard is huge. The typical one is environmental qualification. Well, environmental qualification might cover everything from the marine environment to a high space environment or whatever that standard is, and there's only a certain number of standards that you need to comply with in that particular document. And so this gives me the ability to show which of these standards I'm going to use in my system design. And then the other feature of this is that I have a rationale block in here. So it also, particularly if I say recommended or not required for this applicability, this gives me the ability here to trace or to explain why I'm not using it, or why it's only a recommended requirement and it's not a mandatory requirement. All right, and then here, of course, we have that it's traceable back to this document standard, and this particular requirement here satisfies a particular requirement in the system design. So what I'd like to do here for a moment is I'll go into a model that I've created, which has a number of these things in it, and I'll walk through how I've organized that particular model. So I'm going to go out of this. Of course, whenever you're trying to do something, Outlook decides it's going to take over a little bit of your computer. So I'm going to close my blank project here. This is the blank project where I just imported this to show you what's there. I'm going to switch over to another model that I have here, and this is an industry standards webinar model. And the first thing you'll notice here is I've organized my document folder. So I've extended a blank project and added a bunch of design standards in here, actually 2 design standards to make it simple. So I've organized the document folder here, and I've got a subfolder where I'm going to keep my design standards in there. And if I had a bunch of other user requirements documents, I would put them in here. If I've actually done some formal documentation, done an SSS or an SSDD or something, I would pull those into this formal documentation thing. It's just sort of the way I like to organize the model, but it lends great benefits to me. So I have 2 standards in here. I have this IEC standard and this ISO standard. And I tend to put the names right in the IEC 62196 in there as the name, and it helps me organize. And many times you're looking for a standard like, oh, it's in ISO 83549. Oh, well, that we can go to what that is. And I keep the title of that standard down here in the title attribute. So ISO 62196 is conductive charging of electric vehicles. In this particular standard here, in my description, I put a description there that tells me what it is. This is the IEC code for how to charge a hybrid vehicle. Okay, so that's what this standard is. This other standard here is another standard, ISO 17409, and this is how electrically propelled road vehicle standard, and provides a series of requirements for charging and safety and testing of a hybrid electrical vehicle. So I just tried to find 2 standards that were related for this example, so we could walk through how it works. So I have these 2 standards here, and what I did here, the next thing I want to point out here is down here in my standards folder, I made 2 separate folders, one for all the requirements associated with the 62196 standard, and one for the ISO 17409. It's a nice way to organize these things. So if I look in here, and I want to go back, let me change this first. When you go in here the first time, you'll see that it's done numerically. And let's look at any standard here. So I have this standard here. It's called accessories non-accessibility, kind of a wordy thing, but this particular standard says that accessories should be designed that live parts, when they are wired in normal use, blah, 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 blah. Okay, that's a particular, this is the actual statement out of the standard. This is the name of the paragraph. Okay, and this is the section number. And it's mandatory, and I haven't put any rationale in there. It's just mandatory. I could have put a rationale that says, you know, why I need to have that in there. So now that I have this in the so I have this in my system here. What I wanted to do is I want to be able to look at these in the order of the section. It gives me that's how the document is ordered. So I've made this new sort called section number sort, and now I have these sorted by the section number out of the document. Now, the way you do this in Genesis is if you're in data, you can look at the sort blocks, or if I go down here under utilities and I look at sort blocks, you can see the sort blocks here. And I just created a sort block based on section number. And the way we do this in Genesis is we have the sort criteria here, and then this is the way it's represented. So I'm sorting it on the section number attribute in the pane, and I have the attribute value, section number, and then I have text, which is just a couple of spaces between the section number, and then I pulled up the name of the actual element. So using that sort here gives me a way to organize the document. And again, down here, I have another series of sections here, and this is electrically propelled road vehicles. So when I look here, you'll see some other things. And I couldn't pull up all the actual descriptions on this particular standard because you have to purchase the standard. So for me to show this standard with all of the actual requirements in here, I can't distribute it. So I just put in here some basic requirement text about what these things are. Okay. The other standard, conductive charging of electrical vehicles, is a publicly available standard that you can actually access in the public domain. In this one here, you have to actually purchase the standard in order to be able to use it in your organization. But anyway, the bottom line here is I have the same sort of information. So that goes through, bringing the standards in and how I've organized them. There's a little bit of bringing it in and a little bit of a way to organize it, and I think this works extremely well. So let's go back to the PowerPoint slide for a moment. And I went through the properties here, again, just to review. Here are those properties. So now I want to trace, taking a given standard, how would we trace from the standard to the system design? So I have this schema relationship in my model right now. So I want to be able to trace from the document, pull up all the standards that are in that document, and then trace those standards to trace those to the requirements that satisfy the standard. So the way I'm going to do this is in the Excel connector. So I've created this in here, and I'd like to walk through how I do this in Excel. So let me escape out of this, and I'm going to go into Excel. So here I've opened Excel, and I have the Genesis extension here in my Excel workbook, or in my Excel software. So I'm going to log into Genesis first from Excel. Okay. And you'll see that I can, you look at the blank project or the industry standards webinar model. So this is the model I'm looking at. I'm going to load the table definition, and I want to load the standard document to requirement trace. Okay. So this is the table that I've saved, and I'm going into this folder called Design Standards, and I'm going to pull some information out. So first, I'm going to pull up the standard number, which is the entity here. I'm going to pull up the entity attribute title, and then because I've filed my documents by standard number, you'll have the actual number of the document, then the document name. Now I'm looking at the targets of what it documents. It documents a series of sections. I'm not going to pull that up. What I'm going to pull up is I'm going to pull out the section number, and then the standard name, and then I'm going to pull up the requirement that it satisfies. And when you do that, if I load this in here, it tells me to put it, I'm going to put it in this sheet and clear all the data. And when I do that, you'll get this information. So that information, when I just do a little bit of formatting to it and help it out, I will, for visualization, you'll get to this particular result in Excel. So you can see here I started with, this is my conductive charging of electrical vehicles. I have these section numbers here, these standards, and here's the system requirement that it satisfies. Now, this is a nice report. It helps us see some things, but it also, in this report, I purposely left some things out. You can see that this touch current requirement here, well, I don't have a system requirement by it. So I could use a report like this before an inspector comes in and asks me how did I do my design, obviously. Should I have had systems requirements in here or not? And you could extend this model to take this standard and show its applicability and put another column in here to show was it mandatory requirement or not required? If it's not required, then I wouldn't need a requirement over here. But this is a way to help show this traceability, and it's also a great way for you to look and audit the model yourself. So I've covered how to go from the standard to see, do I have system level requirements? But once my system design is done, the next thing I would probably want to do is to trace from the requirements to the standard. So I have a series of system requirements. How do I know, why do I have those requirements in there? Do I need them? Do they support a standard, or are they excess requirements in my model? So again, I have this notion here of this schema. In this case, instead of starting from the document and going through the standards, what I'm going to do is start from the requirement and trace back to the standards. Where did it come from? So again, I can do this using my Excel connector, just using a different trace. This time I'm going to go from the requirements to the industry standard. So let me go back into here. I'm going to open up a new sheet. Get a new sheet started here. I'm going to load my table definitions here on this sheet, and I'm going to go, and I already have this defined here, requirements to industry standard trace. Now, to be clear here, these tables are not part of the extension. They're tables that I created, and I created them just by going through and editing and creating my own table, much like we did in Core, which you create your table, and you have, these are the positions and column numbers here. So in this case, I started with the requirements, and I'm going through and pulling requirement name complies with the standard, and I'm pulling out the standard title, and the section number. So when I load this, I've got a new sheet, so I'm just going to pull this down up. And so now I have this. So here's a system requirement, and this system requirement, for example, really is showing compliance with two standards, one in ISO 62196 and one in ISO 17409. So in this case, I have this requirement, and it's really designed to meet standards from two different governing bodies. So if I go back, I'd like to go back to my PowerPoint slide again. Let's go down. So that's what this, after I do a little bit of saving it and cleaning it up to make it presentable, a little more presentable, I end up with this table. Now you'll see here, in this case, I have this system requirement, whatever that requirement is. It doesn't comply with the standard. So one of the questions I might ask myself in the design, well, it doesn't comply with the standard, why do I have it in here? It might be necessary for another reason, or it might be a decomposition of something else. But at any rate, you know, why do I have the system requirement in here, and what is it going to, is it meeting a standard or not? Okay, so now I've come at this from two different directions. I have a system. Why do I have those system requirements in there? Well, these system requirements trace to these different standards, and if I have a standard, how am I meeting that standard with my system design? So I have that bidirectional traceability. But the next part is, if I've designed my system, how do I show I've done the design to the standard, but does it meet the performance that's required of the standard? So here's the next problem is, I got to show that I have the design, but have I done the verification of the design to make sure it meets the performance? And this is really what the regulatory agencies want to know is, okay, you said you've designed it that way, but will it work in the way you've designed it? So here's the next challenge, but we've really got this. We really have this already covered in our MBSE model, because without these standards in here, I know that requirements are verified by verification requirements. So now my challenge is to trace from the standard over here to say, okay, here's the standard, here's the design requirement in the standard, and here's the verification requirement I have. And then I need to extend that to show how am I doing that verification requirement, and is that verification requirement going to you know, what type of requirement is, what method did I use, and is it completed? So again, I can work through this by looking at my Excel spreadsheet, or going through my Excel extender with Genesis, and I can walk through this and look in the standard standard to verification requirement trace. So I'm going to switch here back to Excel. I'm going to open up yet another spreadsheet here in Excel, and I'm going to pull in this new table definition here, and I'm going to pull in the standards to verification requirement trace. And so this table gets a little more complicated because what I'm doing here is I am going to pull in the standard number and the document, and I want to pull up the section number and the standard, and then I'm going to take the relationship and show that the standard is satisfied by a particular requirement. So I'll pull up that requirement, and from that requirement then I'm going to pull up the verified by verification requirement, and once I have the verification requirement, then I want to pull up the actual method and the actual status for that verification requirement. You'll notice here once I have the relationships pulled out, what I'm doing below each relationship column, I'm then taking what's in column 6 and looking at attributes of column 6. Here I'm taking out, I pull out what's in 5, which is the satisfied by requirement to get the verification requirement, and work my way around the table. So when I load this then, I'll get this. So I have a particular standard. This section, this standard element is pulling up this satisfied by requirement. This system requirement is verified by whatever this verification requirement is. This particular requirement was done by test, and this particular requirement has been completed satisfactorily. Excuse me. So now I have complete traceability, and if someone asks me, does the system meet? Actually, this one doesn't meet it, right? Because I've got some verification requirements that are not yet planned, and some. I thought I had one that was completed unsatisfactory, but this one's in progress, and this one's not yet planned. And then we got some here where we still don't have any system requirements. We don't have any verification requirements. So again, we come back to this question of what are we doing about these? Do we need these or not? And if I, again, back to my PowerPoint presentation, if I go down to this, you'll see that particular standard results in Excel. So what I've tried to do here is walk us around this model, provide a way to look at not only the standards, but how do I relate the standards to the system requirements that I'm putting together? How do I show traceability from the standard to the system design? How can I show traceability from the system design back to that standard? And then how do I provide an auditable path to show that I've actually verified the system for system certification? So I kind of walk through those spreadsheets relatively quickly. I didn't want to take up a lot of our time in the details there. I wanted to make sure we had this concept here, and then open this up for any questions you might have on how I'm doing this and how I've accomplished this in Genesis. So with that, Donna, do we have any questions out there?
Yeah, thank you, Ron. That was great. We do have a few questions, and thanks to all our participants. I encourage you to join the discussion now and submit your questions using the webinar control panel. First question from Jamie: how do I find the standards out of a standard document that are not applicable or not used in the system design? So an easy way to do that would be to go back to the standard folder here, and I can create a sort block. So if I go back to this folder, let's go to this one. I think this one probably has some that are not required. So if I wanted to go back to this, I could create a filter here, and I can create a new filter to say I'm going to do this as I'll call this not required standards. And now I can take the attribute
sometimes I have to slip back and forth there. I can't remember what that attribute is. It is, hang on a second. It is the standard applicability. Well, I can't remember exactly what the name is here. I'd have to go back to the so when you can't find this, the easy way to do it is to go to the schema, classes, standard. Its applicability is the attribute I want to do, so I'll go back to my filters. Applicability equals not required. Okay, so there is the filter I'm going to use, and if I go back to here and I go to the not required standards, you would see that in this one they're all required. Let's go to this one here. Oh, I've done something wrong. It always happens when you're trying to demonstrate this live, right?
Choose the standard applicability filter. You changed the wrong.
I changed the wrong filter. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
See, that's why Donna's here. She keeps me on my...
You want the not required standards.
Ah, see that? Donna keeps me on my toes.
It's easier to view from here.
So that's the not required standards, and then if I go back here to this and pick my filter, so this one's not required under this standard, and these 5 are not required for this standard. And then if you actually picked the standard, you'd see the not required there. It's funny when I teach in class, it's like, you never get these things right in class. You always have to go back and forth, but it's instructive to know that it's not just because you do something you can go back and fix it, and you don't always get it right. Whenever I do a table, I don't get it right the first time, but that's not, don't let that discourage you. All right?
Okay, we ready to move on to the next question?
Yep, I'm good.
Okay, question from Sharon. How do I know where or in what test a particular verification requirement was tested?
So that's easy because I have a verification requirement here, and a verification requirement is fulfilled by an operational test. So what I could do is I could extend my table, the table that I created. Let me show you this table here. I'll go back to the slide here. If I took this table and I take out the method and status, and I could say this verification requirement is fulfilled by a verification event, and I would know which event each of these are in. Okay. And the way you would do that is I would, and I won't go through this all on the in here because I'd have to go in and modify this particular trace, but I would remove the method and the status off of this table and add the relationship fulfilled by and put a verification event in there, and then the table would walk from the requirement through the verification requirement and to the verification event. And it's all because the standard schema in core, I'm going to page up one more to show you that the verification requirement here is fulfilled by a verification event. That isn't shown in the schema. This is the basic schema in core or in Genesis, either or, to do that. Okay?
Okay.
Another question?
Yeah, one last question, unless people start popping up. This is from Andrew. This webinar was completed using Genesis. Can I do this in core as well?
Well, all the same basic relationships are available in core as they are in Genesis. Nothing is different here. All the schema things that I've shown you here are in core. They're also in Genesis. Genesis has a different interface for the CSV import export. There's a different what do I want to say, menu that pops out to do the import export using core. In Genesis we use the ribbon bar in Excel. In core we have a series of menus that are driven inside of core to actually do the export and extract things into a CSV file spreadsheet, which then you just save as an Excel spreadsheet to get the formatting in there. But it's the same thing. The difference is with Genesis is I have this ribbon bar in here that allows me to work directly in Excel rather than going through an intermediate menu in core to get this information into an Excel spreadsheet. But all the same things exist, and the extension is the same in Genesis, in core also as it is in Genesis.
Okay, we did have one final one come in. It was from Mahendra. I apologize if I did not say that right. How do I update the test completion and progress towards the requirement in the respective standards?
Well, so go back into Genesis here, go back into our model. Here's the verification requirement. Let's find. So this was one. This was completed unsatisfactory. I'm trying to find one that's not yet planned. If I was to do this and say that this was completed now satisfactory, this is verification requirement 110, keep that in mind. I'm going to go to this spreadsheet here. Verification requirement 110 is right here, not yet planned. So what I'm going to do is pull this table definition out again. And this table definition was, I believe, standard to verification requirement trace. And I'm going to load this again. And we're looking for this thing to actually change. I'm going to update it. What this does, it'll delete everything that's in here and then update the entire table. And I changed it in the model, and now it's been updated here on my tracking sheet, if you will. Okay. I think that the way you would end up doing these is from the model, because you're not doing it. I wouldn't do it from the spreadsheet and push it back into the model, because these verification requirements would come in from a different venue. So, but you could also push it back from the Excel spreadsheet back in, if that's what you want, if that's what you're desired to do.
Okay, Ron, I think we've got time. Hopefully this will be a quick one. We got one last one that I think is interesting.
Okay.
Thanks for the straightforward presentation. My question is, how is it related to DODAF, and how can this be done within that architecture framework?
Well, so I think the standards are really more of the system design side, but the schema I'm using here is the standard, is the systems schema, not the operational architecture schema. Now, there could be standards that are requiring you to do an operational, to require you to meet a capability or an operational activity, in which case what I would do is and find a slide with one of my schemas with the schema on it. Let's do this one right here. So here's the schema that I have, and I've only related this standard to this requirement, but this standard may also be used to relate to a capability. So if I had a new capability, if I have a standard to do something and I want or I have a capability that's going to comply with a particular standard, I would just extend the schema to show this satisfied by and compliance with a particular capability. And then I would be able to show, I can do the same sort of traces that I have here that show the capability this capability is satisfying a particular standard, and that standard shows compliance with this capability. Of course, that capability would then also be related to it would be implemented by a requirement in a particular system or several systems design. So that's the way I would handle that. You could also then extend the like a capability like the CV capability view 2 or 3, if it's going to meet a particular standard, that can be used. And then in the technical views, the TV1 or TV2, you can also pull those standards into those technical views, the standards that are added to the architecture.
Okay. I think that's all we have today. I apologize if we didn't get your question. We'll get back to you right after the webinar. If you have any further comments or questions, please don't hesitate to send Ron an email. His address is not on the screen at the moment, but
oh, that's because I need to go to the last one. Donna keeps me honest on all this stuff here. Let's go all the way down to the last screen here. Sorry about that.
No worries, but I just think if the people in the audience would like to get it, they can.
There you go.
They can get it from the screen now.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming today. Our next webinar is going to be on the key to systems engineering success by Zane Scott. The link to the registration the link to register. Sorry, I'm fumbling words now. Is on our website, and I will send out a chat now with that information. Remember that at the conclusion of this webinar, a survey will open on your screen. Please take a moment to give us feedback on today's presentation or on what topics you'd like to see covered in future webinars. That's all for today. Once again, thank you for joining us, and have a wonderful day.